Want to ride with me tonight?" The stranger's voice was low, unhurried, cutting straight through the silence of the street. Eliza Harper stood outside Pruitt's store with her last coin in her fist and humiliation burning through her chest. She had just been turned away in front of the entire town. Her son hadn't eaten since yesterday, and now a man she had never seen, rugged quiet, with eyes the color of a storm, deciding what it wanted to be, was looking at her like she was worth something. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his intentions. She only knew she was out of options. If this story already has your heart, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel, stay until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The coin sat there on the counter between them, small, tarnished, and absolutely useless in the face of a man who had already made up his mind. Eliza didn't move. She was 25 years old, and she had already learned that flinching in public cost you more than anything on Gerald Pruitt's shelves. So she kept her spine straight and her jaw locked, and she breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her when she was small, slow in, slow out. Don't let them see you shake. Gerald. Her voice came out quieter than she wanted. It's a sack of flour and some dried beans. My son is 6 years old. I know how old your boy is. Pruitt crossed his arms over his chest. He was a thick man, red-faced from years of Wyoming sun and self-importance. I also know your husband's been in the ground 4 months, and you haven't made a payment on your account in 2 of them. I've been working the land myself. That's not my concern. He's 6, Gerald. The answer is no, Eliza. He said her name like a door closing. You want to run a tab at my store, you bring me collateral. Land deed, livestock, something real. Otherwise, you pay cash, or you walk out the same way you walked in. Someone behind her shifted. A boot scuffed the floorboard. She didn't turn around to see who was watching. She already knew half of Millhaven had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon than stand in Pruitt's general store and witness whatever humiliation the day served up. She picked up the coin. Her fingers were steady. She was proud of that later, how steady her fingers were. Fine, she said. She turned and walked to the door. The bell above it rang when she pushed through, bright and cheerful, completely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. Go. The street outside was dusty and wide and indifferent in its own way, the kind of street that existed to move people from one end of town to the other without caring much about any of them. A wagon rolled past, 2 men on horses, a woman with a basket who caught Eliza's eye and immediately looked away. That was the part that always hit hardest. Not Gerald's refusal, not the debt she couldn't pay. It was the looking away, the way a whole town could watch you suffer and find something very important to study in the opposite direction. Eliza leaned against the post outside the store and breathed. She had 4 miles between her and the homestead. She had no food. She had a 6-year-old named Thomas who had asked her that morning in the way children ask things, honest and direct, and with complete faith that she would have an answer. Mama, is there going to be supper tonight? She'd said yes. She'd said it before she thought about it, the way mothers do, the automatic reassurance that flies out of your mouth on instinct. And then she'd ridden into Millhaven on a borrowed horse with her last coin in her pocket and found out that yes had been a lie. Hard morning. The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't seem to need anything from her. She turned. The man was leaning against the post about 6 feet down, arms crossed loosely over his chest, one boot hitched up on the rail. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing trail-worn clothes that had seen serious use. His hat was pulled low. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes, when she caught them, that were the particular gray of a sky right before it decided what kind of storm it wanted to be. She did not know him. She knew almost everyone in Millhaven and a fair portion of the surrounding county, and she did not know this man. I'm fine, she said, which was the response she gave to that question regardless of accuracy. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer. I wasn't trying to pry. You were listening to what happened in there. I was standing in line, he said, buying rope. Hard not to hear. Eliza looked at him directly, The way she'd learned to look at men who might or might not mean something by whatever they were doing. She'd learned to read intent pretty quickly after Daniel died, or maybe she'd learned it before that during the years of being young and female in a world that had opinions about both. This man didn't look away, but he also didn't push. He just looked back at her with those gray eyes, calm and undemanding, like he had all afternoon, and no particular stake in what she did with it. "I don't need help," she said. "I didn't offer any." That stopped her. She blinked. He was right, he hadn't offered a single thing. He'd asked if she was having a hard morning. She almost smiled. She caught herself. "Luke Morgan," he said and held out a hand. Not reaching across her space, just extending it, take it or leave it. She shook it. "Eliza Harper." "I know," he said. "I passed your place riding in. You're about 4 miles out East Road, the Harper homestead." Her chin lifted. "You make a habit of noting whose land belongs to who. I make a habit of knowing the territory." He pushed off the post, stood to his full height. He was taller than she'd gauged. "I'm riding east when I leave here. If you need a ride back to your property, the offer's there. No charge, no conversation required if you'd rather not." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. The sun was getting toward mid-afternoon. She had 4 miles on foot, no horse of her own, and Thomas waiting at the homestead with an empty stomach and absolute faith in her. "My horse is at the livery," she said. "Then I'll walk you there." He said it simply. No grand gesture. No waiting for gratitude. She fell into step beside him, and neither of them said another word until they reached the livery, and she discovered, standing at the stall, patting her borrowed mare's nose, that Luke Morgan had already settled her boarding tab. She turned on him immediately. "I didn't ask you to do that. No, you didn't." He wasn't sorry about it. "Mrs. Aldridge, who runs this livery, told me this morning you'd been bringing that horse in on credit. I settled it. Don't read anything into it you don't want to. That is money out of your pocket for a woman you don't know." "It's $2, he said, "and I've spent worse." She should have refused. Everything she'd built in 4 months of widowhood, every hard wall, every careful instinct, every lesson learned from being alone and vulnerable in a place that respected neither, told her to hand him back those $2 and ride home proud. She didn't. She couldn't explain it then, and later she would think about it often, that first moment of not refusing. What it cost her. What it meant that it cost her so little. She rode home. He rode east. Their roads split about a mile outside town, and she told herself as she watched him disappear around the tree line that that was that. A stranger with kind eyes and no apparent agenda. The frontier had those sometimes. You didn't build a story on it. Thomas was sitting on the porch step when she got back the way he always was, waiting, because waiting for her was the only job he believed he had. He was small for 6, dark-haired like his father, with eyes that held too much understanding for his age. "Did you get flour, Mama?" She climbed down from the horse. She didn't answer right away because she was looking at the porch step, specifically at the burlap sack sitting beside her son that had not been there when she left that morning. "Thomas." Her voice came out strange. "Where did that come from?" He looked at the sack like it was the most natural thing in the world. "A man left it. Tall man with a gray hat. He said it was for Mrs. Harper, from a friend of the road." Thomas looked up at her. "Are we friends with men on roads now, Mama?" Eliza crouched down and opened the sack with hands that were not quite steady. Flour, dried beans, a small wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, 4 potatoes, a twist of salt. Not extravagant, practical. The things a person actually needed to feed a child through the week. She sat down on the porch step beside her son and just breathed. "Mama, is it okay?" "It's okay, baby." She pulled him close, pressed her lips to the top of his head. "We're going to be all right tonight." She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark of her bedroom, the room she'd shared with Daniel, still full of the shape of him somehow, 3 years of marriage pressing into the walls, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to sort out what she felt. Grateful. She was grateful. She was also furious at being grateful, which was the particular knot of emotion that came from accepting help when you hadn't asked for it and couldn't repay it. There was something in that sack of flour that felt like it complicated everything, and she didn't want complications. She wanted to survive. Simple, clean, one foot in front of the other. Luke Morgan was not simple. She'd known him 2 hours, and she could already tell that. In the morning, she made biscuits with the flour and watched Thomas eat 3 of them at the kitchen table with an expression of total uncomplicated happiness. And she thought, whatever it costs, whatever comes next, at least tonight, he ate. That was what she held on to. Luke Morgan came back 3 days later. She was in the yard splitting wood, an activity that in another life would have been Daniel's, but in this life had become hers, along with everything else that required physical strength and a certain willingness to be uncomfortable. She heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up, and there he was, coming down the lane at an easy walk, no hurry to him at all. She kept splitting. Let him come to her. He pulled up a respectful distance away, dismounted, looped his reins around the fence post. "Morning?" "Morning." She set another log on the block. He looked at the pile she'd split, looked at the pile she still had to do, looked at the axe in her hands. "Can I help with that?" "I can split my own wood, Mr. Morgan." "I didn't say you couldn't." He folded his hands over the top of the fence. "I asked if I could help." She stopped, looked at him. "Why do you keep coming back here?" He considered the question seriously, which she hadn't expected. He didn't smile it away or wave it off. He thought about it. "I don't entirely know," he said finally. "I was passing through Millhaven looking for work. I've got no particular place I have to be. And you?" He paused. "You're out here alone with a young boy and a property that needs work, and I can see it needs it from the road. I'm good with my hands. It's as simple as that if you want it to be. And if I don't want it to be simple, then we can have the more complicated conversation." She set the axe down. She crossed her arms. The wind was cold off the mountains, and she could feel it through her coat, and she thought about Thomas inside drawing letters on his slate, like she'd taught him 3 biscuits worth of energy running through his small body. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I know. I'm not looking for a man to take over this land or make decisions for it. I know that too. Daniel, my husband, he's 4 months gone. I'm still—" She stopped. That sentence didn't have a clean end. "You don't owe me any explanation about what you're still," Luke said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything from you. Not a meal, not your time, not your gratitude. If you want me to leave, I'll leave, and you won't see me again. But if you'll let me, I'd like to fix that fence along your north pasture, because it's been down since before the snow and your livestock can wander. That's it. That's all I'm offering." Eliza looked at the north fence. She'd been meaning to fix it herself for 3 weeks. She hadn't had time. She'd barely had time to breathe. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "You can have some when you're done." She picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. She heard him moving around to the north fence, quiet and purposeful, and she let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 days. He fixed the fence. He drank 1 cup of coffee standing in the yard, and he left before noon. No fanfare, no expectation. He came back the following Tuesday, fixed a broken hinge on the barn door, drank his coffee, left. Thursday patched the roof over the lean-to where she kept the tools. Left without being asked to stay. Thomas watched him from the porch with large, serious eyes, and the particular calculating attention of a boy who has decided he's the man of the house and isn't entirely sure whether a newcomer is a threat or an ally. "He fixes things," Thomas told Eliza one evening with great authority. "He does," she agreed. "Why?" "I don't know yet, baby." Thomas thought about it. "I think it's because he's good," he announced with the simple certainty of 6 years old. "Some people are just good." Eliza wanted to say that she wasn't sure she believed that anymore, that the last 4 months had worn the belief in simple goodness down to something thin and careful. But she looked at her son's face open, certain still intact in ways she feared for, and she said nothing. Maybe she thought. Maybe some people are just good. She was afraid to find out for certain, because if she was wrong, it would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. It was Agnes Whitmore who came first. 60s, sharp-faced, with the particular energy of a woman who had deputized herself as community conscience decades ago and had never been stripped of the post. She arrived on a Saturday morning in a wagon driven by her son, who had the good sense to stay with the horses. "Eliza Harper," she said, climbing down, and her voice had that particular quality, warm on the surface, cold about 4 inches in. "I hear you've got a hired man out here." "Good morning, Agnes." Eliza was on the porch, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She did not invite her up. "I'm only asking because people are concerned." Agnes folded her hands at her waist. "A widow woman alone on a property, letting a strange man come and go. He's helped with some repairs." "What kind of repairs is what everyone's wondering." Eliza looked at her. "The fence kind," she said, perfectly even. "The barn door kind. The roof kind." Agnes's mouth tightened. "You know how it looks." "I know how some people choose to see it." "Your reputation, Eliza." "Is mine." She stood up from the porch railing. "Thank you for coming out, Agnes. You've got a long ride back." Agnes stared at her for a moment, recalibrating. Then she lifted her chin. "I'm only saying this because I knew your mother." "My mother," Eliza said, "would have told you to mind your own affairs. She just would have said it more politely than I'm inclined to." Agnes left. Eliza watched the wagon roll back down the lane and felt the satisfaction of that exchange for exactly 40 seconds before the doubt came in, quiet, insidious, picking at the edges. Because Agnes wasn't wrong about one thing. People were watching. People were always watching a young widow out here alone, and their watching had weight, and their opinions had consequences. She had to sell her livestock eventually. She had to buy from Pruitt's store eventually. She lived in this town for better or worse, and the town was watching what she let Luke Morgan do in her yard. She thought about telling him not to come back. She was still thinking about it when she heard Thomas calling from around the barn. "Mama, Mr. Luke is here." And she heard the unguarded excitement in her son's voice, the pure, uncomplicated joy of a boy who had started watching the road each morning. And she pressed her hand flat against the porch railing and felt the grain of the wood under her palm, solid and real. Not yet, she thought. She couldn't do it yet. Luke came around the corner of the barn with Thomas at his heels, his gray hat tipped back, something in his hand. A carving he'd made, apparently a small wooden horse. He was showing Thomas how he'd done it, the angle of the knife, the grain of the wood, and Thomas was listening with the absolute full-body attention he gave to things that mattered to him. Something shifted in Eliza's chest, something she didn't have a name for, something she wasn't ready to name. She went inside to start lunch before either of them could see her face. By the end of the 3rd week, the north pasture fence was finished. The barn had a solid roof. The broken step on the porch, the one she'd meant to fix since August, had been replaced with fresh timber that didn't give under your foot. The homestead looked like someone was fighting for it. Eliza stood in the yard one evening after Thomas was asleep and looked at the place she'd been terrified she would lose. It looked different. It looked like what it could be if someone kept fighting. If she kept fighting? She didn't say that to Luke. She wasn't ready to say things like that to him. But she poured him a second cup of coffee the next morning without being asked, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand why Thomas believed some people were just good. She was also starting to be afraid of how much she wanted that to be true. The second cup of coffee became a habit, not a spoken one. Nobody declared it. Nobody made a rule out of it. It simply happened the way real things happen, quietly and without fanfare, until one morning Eliza realized she was pouring it before she even heard his boots on the step. And the realization sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. That was the thing about Luke Morgan that she couldn't find fault with, no matter how hard she tried. And she tried because finding fault would have been easier than whatever this was becoming. He never pushed, never leaned, never looked at her like a man tallying up what he was owed for every repaired hinge and split cord of wood. He came, he worked, he drank his coffee standing in the yard, and he left. Sometimes Thomas talked his ear off, and Luke listened with the patience of a man who genuinely found a 6-year-old's opinions about horses to be worth hearing. Sometimes they barely exchanged a dozen words. Either way, he showed up the next time like nothing needed to be explained or justified. It was the most disarming thing anyone had ever done to her. She found herself waiting for the catch, because in Eliza Harper's experience, 25 years of it, including 3 years of a marriage that had started with love and ended with loneliness. Before Daniel ever went into the ground, there was always a catch. Men who gave without asking were usually saving up the asking for something bigger. She watched for it. She kept watching. It didn't come. It was a Wednesday, 4 weeks after she'd met him outside Pruitt's store, when Luke showed up with a second horse in tow, a bay mare older but solid, and told her he'd noticed she was still borrowing the livery horse, and that wasn't sustainable. Eliza came off the porch so fast she nearly missed the step. "Where did that come from?" "Rancher east of here, Sam Fielding. He's got more horses than he needs, and he's willing to work a trade." Luke held the mare's lead rope loose in his hand. "I told him you'd do 3 weeks of mending work shirts, trousers, whatever his crew needs sewn. He said that's fair. You negotiated a trade on my behalf." Her voice was careful, too careful. "I offered a possibility," he said. "You can say no. You should have asked me first." He looked at her steadily. "You're right. I should have. No defensiveness, no justification. Just, you're right. I saw the problem, and I moved before I thought about whose problem it was to solve. I'm sorry." She stared at him. In her experience, men who were told they'd overstepped either argued the point or overcorrected into wounded silence. Luke Morgan just stood there, and was sorry clean and simple, and waited for her to decide what happened next. The mare was beautiful. She was practical and solid and exactly what the homestead needed, and Eliza was furious at how badly she wanted to accept. 3 weeks of mending," she said finally. "That's the trade. I'd have to see Fielding's terms myself. I'll ride with you when you're ready." She looked at the mare for a long moment. Then she walked over, put her hand on the horse's neck, felt the muscle and warmth of her. The mare turned her head and blew a soft breath against Eliza's shoulder. "What's her name?" "Fielding calls her June." "June," Eliza said. And something in her voice went softer than she meant it to. Thomas came running from around the side of the house, stopped dead when he saw the horse, and looked up at Luke with eyes the size of $50. "Is that ours?" "That's your mama's call," Luke said. Thomas turned to Eliza with the full, devastating power of 6-year-old hope aimed directly at her face. She almost laughed. Almost. "Go get her some water," she told him. "Barn bucket." Thomas was gone before she finished the sentence. She rode out to Fielding's ranch that Friday, Luke beside her, and she negotiated the mending terms herself. She made that clear before they left, that she would do the talking, that Luke was there to ride with her, and nothing else. He agreed without blinking. Sam Fielding turned out to be a weathered man in his 60s, suspicious of strangers, and immediately respectful of a woman who looked him in the eye and knew what her labor was worth. They settled terms in under 20 minutes. Eliza came away with the horse 3 weeks of mending work, and though she'd never admit this to anyone, a kind of quiet satisfaction that felt unfamiliar after months of only surviving. On the ride back, Luke said, "You're good at that." "At what?" "Knowing what you're worth, and not moving off it." She looked straight ahead at the road. "I had to learn." "Most people never do." He said it without any particular emphasis, just as an observation. They let other people set the number. She thought about Gerald Pruitt's counter and the coin she'd pushed back. She thought about Daniel, who had loved her, but had also quietly and without malice made most of the decisions, and left her to discover after he was gone how little she'd been taught to make them herself. "I'm still learning," she said. "Aren't we all? It was the most they'd talked in a single conversation. And afterward, the silence between them felt different, not empty but full, the way a room feels different after someone said something true in it. The mending work for Fielding's crew started the following Monday, and it was harder than she'd anticipated. Not the sewing itself, but the logistics of managing it alongside the homestead. She was up before dawn, working the land through the morning sewing, through the afternoon, cooking, managing Thomas, and falling into bed so tired that sleep came before she could think about being afraid. Luke noticed. Of course he noticed. He didn't say anything about it. But one morning she came outside to find the garden turned over. She'd been meaning to prepare it for planting and hadn't had the time, and the fence posts along the south side reset in the ground properly, no longer leaning at the precarious angle that had been bothering her for weeks. She stood there looking at it, and something hot and complicated moved through her chest, and she had to go back inside for a minute and stand at the kitchen sink and breathe. She didn't want to need this. That was the honest truth of it. She had spent 4 months building a version of herself that didn't need anything from anyone, and Luke Morgan was dismantling it one fence post at a time, and she couldn't figure out whether to be grateful or terrified. Both, she decided. She felt both. The town kept talking. She heard it in fragments, not directed at her because nobody in Millhaven was quite brave enough for that after she'd sent Agnes Whitmore home with something to think about. But in the pauses when she rode in for supplies, in the way conversations shifted, when she passed in the particular silence of women at the dry goods counter who were definitely not discussing her. Reverend Hartley was more direct. He stopped her after the Sunday service she made herself attend for Thomas's sake, for the routine of it, and walked with her toward her horse with his hands folded and his face arranged into concern. Eliza. He said her name the way men said it when they were about to say something they'd dressed up as pastoral care. There are people in this congregation who worry for you. I'm well, Reverend. The man who's been coming to your property has repaired my north fence, replaced my porch step, and helped me secure a horse through legitimate trade. She untied June from the post. If the congregation would like to make a list of additional concerns, they can leave it with me, and I'll review it at my convenience. Hartley blinked. I only mean, I know what you mean. She kept her voice even. Not angry, she couldn't afford angry, not in public, not with an audience of Sunday churchgoers within earshot. My husband died 4 months ago. I have a child and a homestead and land I'm trying to hold. If someone chooses to help with that, it is my choice and my business, and I'll ask that you trust my judgment. She rode home with Thomas behind her on the saddle, and her jaw set, and her eyes burning in a way she refused to call crying. Thomas put his arms around her waist and said nothing, and that quiet understanding from a 6-year-old was somehow the thing that almost broke her. That afternoon, Luke came by. He took one look at her face. She thought she had it under control, thought she'd put it somewhere. He couldn't see it, and said quietly, "Bad morning." She laughed, and it came out wrong, too sharp at the edges. Reverend Hartley has concerns about my choices. Luke was quiet for a moment. Does it bother you? What they say. Of course it bothers me. The words came out before she could catch them. I have to live here. These are the people I buy from and sell to and see every week. Of course it bothers me. She stopped, drew a breath. What bothers me more is that it bothers me. I know what's true. I know what you've done and what you haven't done, and I know the difference between a man helping and a man taking advantage. But knowing the truth doesn't make it easier to walk into town and feel their eyes. Luke sat down on the porch step. He turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation. I can stop coming, he said. If it's making your life harder, I can stop. Don't. The word came out before she thought it. He looked up at her. She felt heat rise in her face. Don't stop on account of what they think. That's no. I'm not making decisions based on Agnes Whitmore's opinions. I made that decision and I'm standing on it. He watched her for a moment, something unreadable moving behind those gray eyes. Then he nodded, put his hat back on, and stood up. I'm going to look at that section of wall in the barn that's been bothering me. The planking's soft. There's coffee on the stove. I'll get it when I'm done. She watched him walk toward the barn, and she pressed her lips together, and she thought, whatever this is, wherever it goes, I am not letting other people's fear make the decision for me. Not this time, not again. It was Thomas who changed everything that evening. Or rather, Thomas, who said the thing that Eliza had been carefully not thinking. They were at the table after supper. Thomas drawing his letters on his slate, Luke sitting across from him with a cup of coffee, and a piece of rope he was showing the boy how to knot. It was so domestic and ordinary that it hurt to look at directly the way looking at something bright too long starts to ache. Thomas said without looking up from his letters, "Mr. Luke, are you going to stay?" The silence had weight. Luke glanced at Eliza. She was looking at her coffee cup. "That's something I'd have to talk to your mama about," Luke said carefully. "She likes you," Thomas said with the authority of a child who has observed something adults are pretending not to notice. "She checks if you're coming before she starts her morning." Eliza set her coffee cup down with a sound that was slightly too firm. "Thomas," she said, "finish your letters." "I'm just saying what I see." "Finish your letters." Thomas finished his letters. But he did it with the particular expression of a 6-year-old who knows he's not wrong and is only waiting. Luke, to his credit, looked at nothing. He just worked his rope knot with quiet, careful hands and let the moment settle. Later, after Thomas was in bed, Eliza came out to the porch where Luke was sitting, before riding back to wherever he'd set up camp. She'd never asked. She realized. She didn't know where he slept, whether it was the boarding house in town or trail camp or somewhere else entirely, and the gap in her knowledge felt suddenly significant. "You should know," she said without preamble, "that I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm 25 years old, and I've been a wife, and I've been a widow, and right now, I don't know what I am, except someone trying to hold a piece of land and raise a child. I don't know how to be anything else yet." Luke said nothing. He was listening in that complete way he had, like the rest of the world could wait. "I'm not saying anything about what this is or what it isn't," she continued, because she couldn't stop. Now she'd started, and the pressure of it had been building for weeks. "I'm just saying that I notice things. I noticed that you came back. I noticed the fence, and the horse, and the garden turned over. I notice—" Her voice nearly broke. She caught it. "I noticed that Thomas looks for you in the morning." "What about you?" His voice was very quiet. She looked at the dark yard, the land she was fighting to keep the mountains beyond. That didn't care about any of it. "I check if you're coming before I start my morning," she admitted, and the words cost her something real. "I'm telling you that, so you know it matters what you do here, what you decide. It matters to more than just the fence." Luke was quiet for a long time. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a thinking quiet, a real one. "I'm not going anywhere," he said at last. "Not unless you tell me to. And even then—" He paused. "I'd argue about it first." She almost smiled. She was getting better at almost. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Where do you sleep?" He blinked. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. "Boarding house in town. Mrs. Aldridge has a room above the livery." "How long have you been in Millhaven?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She counted backward. "That's 2 weeks before you found me at Pruitt's store." "Yes." "What were you doing for those 2 weeks?" He looked at her steadily. "Looking for work, getting the lay of the land. And then you saw a woman get turned away at the store and decided to adopt her." "Decide to help," he said simply. "That's all I decided." She studied him. The lamp from inside was throwing just enough light to see his face, and his face was honest, genuinely honest, the kind of honest that couldn't be faked without great effort over a sustained period, and she had been watching him for a month. "Where were you before Millhaven?" "Montana. Before that, Colorado." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've been moving a while." Moving away from something or toward something. The question landed differently than she intended. She saw it, the small shift in him, something that moved behind his eyes and then went still. "Away," he said. "For a long time away." He looked at her. "I don't know yet if that's changed." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her, and it was also the most terrifying, not because it was a warning, but because it wasn't. He wasn't warning her off. He was telling her where he'd been and leaving the rest of it open. She said, "All right." Just that. "All right." She went back inside. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the sound of his horse moving down the lane, growing quieter, disappearing. She pressed her hand against the blanket and felt her own heartbeat and thought Daniel. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if this is foolish or brave or both. But I am alive, and I'm still fighting for this land, and tonight something in my chest felt warm for the first time in 4 months. I don't know if that's wrong. I hope it isn't wrong." No answer came. It never did. But in the morning, she woke up before dawn, and she started the coffee early, and she told herself it was because there was a lot of work to do. She almost believed it. The twist came on a Tuesday of all days, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself. Eliza rode into Millhaven to deliver the first week of Fielding's mending and pick up thread at the dry goods store. She tied June outside, carried the bundled shirts under her arm, and was crossing the main street when she heard her name not called to her, but said by someone who didn't know she was close enough to hear. Gerald Pruitt's voice, coming from the gap between the hardware store and the assay office where men stood to talk when they wanted less than a full audience. "Widow's getting cozy with that drifter, and I'm telling you it's only a matter of time before she can't hold the note on that land." Another voice, she didn't know it. "What note?" "Harper had a credit arrangement on the homestead. Land debt. Daniel signed it before he died." Pruitt's voice was lower now, but she could still catch it, could hear the particular oily satisfaction under the words. "Payment's overdue. I've been patient given her circumstances, but patience has limits. Man can't run a business on sentiment." "What are you going to do?" Pruitt said, "I'm going to wait a little longer. Let her think she's managing. And then I'm going to call the note, and that land goes to the highest offer. I've already had interest." Eliza stood perfectly still in the middle of the street. The shirts were still under her arm. The thread she'd come for was still in the dry goods store. The world was still moving around her wagon wheels, voices the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday, and she was standing at the center of it, absolutely unable to move. There was a debt on the land. Daniel had signed something. She hadn't known because Daniel hadn't told her, because Daniel had handled the business side of everything. And she'd let him because that was how things worked, and she'd never imagined she would need to know. She hadn't known. And Gerald Pruitt had been counting the days. She made herself walk. 1 foot, then the other. She delivered the shirts to Fielding's man waiting at the livery. She bought her thread. She rode June home at a walk, because she didn't trust herself to push the horse faster without losing her grip on the careful, deliberate calm she was using to hold herself together. When she got home, Luke was there. He was working on the garden sleeves, pushed up hands in the dirt. He looked up when she rode in, and something in her face must have told him everything, because he was standing before she'd even dismounted. "What happened?" she told him. All of it, every word she'd heard, as exact as she could recall it. She stood in her yard, and she told him in a flat, careful voice, because the flat, careful voice was the only way she could say it without something else breaking through. When she finished, Luke was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Do you have Daniel's papers?" "What papers?" "Whatever he signed. The credit arrangement. Whatever document Pruitt is holding, there's a copy somewhere. Daniel would have kept it." She thought about the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. Daniel's box, the one she'd looked at once after he died, and then closed and not touched since, because it hurt too much. "Maybe," she said. "We need to read it." Luke's voice was steady. Not urgent, not panicked, just very clear. "Before Pruitt makes a move, you need to know exactly what was signed, and when, and what the terms are. You can't fight something you can't see." "I don't know if I can fight it at all." The words came out before she could stop them. "If there's a debt, and I can't pay..." "Don't finish that sentence yet." He stepped closer, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the particular gravity of a person who is not panicking on your behalf. Don't finish it until you've read the papers. Do you understand me? Not yet. She looked at him, 25 years old, and she was standing on land that might not be hers. And the only person standing in her yard who wasn't afraid was this man she'd known 5 weeks, and she didn't know whether to trust that or be more afraid of it. She took a breath. The box is under the bedroom floor. Then let's start there. She led him inside into the bedroom she still thought of as Daniel's, and she pulled up the floorboard with hands that trembled slightly, and she brought out the tin box and set it on the bed, and she opened it. The paper was there. Third from the top. She read it once, twice, and then a third time because she needed to be certain she understood it. When she looked up, Luke was watching her face. He borrowed against the land, she said. $60. 6 months ago, 3 months before he died. Her voice was hollow. The payment was due in full on the 1st of next month. What do you have? She knew the number. She'd known the number every single day for 4 months. $11 and some. Luke said nothing for a moment. He looked at the paper in her hands. Can I see it? She handed it to him. He read it carefully, turning it over, reading the back. Who witnessed this? She looked. 2 signatures. One was Pruitt's. One was... She frowned. I don't know this name. Luke looked at where she pointed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's interesting, he said, and his voice had changed something under it now that she hadn't heard before. Something that sounded like recognition. Do you know who that is? He set the paper down on the bed carefully. I might, he said. I need to think about it. Luke? She looked at him directly. What do you know? What is it you're not saying? He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, something crossed his face that she couldn't entirely read, something older than anything he'd shown her before. Give me until tomorrow morning, he said. There's something I need to find out first, and then I'll tell you everything. She wanted to push. Every instinct in her said, push, demand, don't let him walk out of this room with something that belonged to her situation. But she also knew from a month of watching him that Luke Morgan did not say, I'll tell you everything, lightly. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. I'll be here before the coffee's ready. He left. She sat on the edge of the bed with the tin box open beside her and Daniel's paper in her hands, and she thought about all the things she hadn't known, and all the things she still didn't, and the particular shape of the fear that came from realizing the ground under your feet had been compromised long before you ever started to trust it. She also thought about Luke's face when he'd seen that second signature. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would know. She put the paper back in the box, put the box back under the floor, and she went to start supper. She fed Thomas. She listened to him talk about the horse and the knot Luke had taught him, and a bird he'd seen that he was fairly sure was the biggest bird in Wyoming. And she thought, whatever is coming, whatever Pruitt is planning, and whatever Luke knows, I am not losing this land. I am not going to let a debt Daniel signed in secret take the only thing left that belongs to my son. She had $11. She had a month. She had a rugged cowboy riding toward information she didn't have yet. And she had, for the first time in 4 months, something that felt dangerously close to anger instead of despair. Anger, she had learned, was easier to work with. He was there before the coffee was ready. Eliza heard the hoofbeats while she was still striking the match, and something in her chest released a tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding through the entire night. She'd slept badly, not the restless half-sleep of exhaustion, but the wide-eyed, ceiling-staring kind that comes when your mind refuses to stop working a problem. It doesn't have enough pieces to solve. She'd lain there running numbers she already knew didn't add up. Thinking about Daniel's signature on that paper, about Pruitt's voice in the gap between buildings, about the look on Luke's face when he'd seen the second name. She had the coffee poured by the time he knocked. He always knocked, never just walked in, and she'd stopped noticing how much that mattered until just now. Come in. He came through the door hat in hand, and he looked like a man who also hadn't slept. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, and he sat down at the table without being invited, which was new, and set his hat on the wood beside him. She set the coffee in front of him, sat across from him, waited. "The second witness," he said, "is a man named Calhoun. Roy Calhoun. He runs a land acquisition operation out of Cheyenne, moves through small towns, finds properties with debt or unclear title, and helps men like Pruitt engineer situations where distressed landowners have to sell at a fraction of value." Eliza was very still. "How do you know that name?" Luke wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Because 18 months ago, Roy Calhoun did the same thing to a family in Montana, a rancher named Everett, his wife, their 2 sons. Calhoun and a local merchant conspired to call a fraudulent debt. The family lost the property inside 60 days. He paused. "The rancher was my brother-in-law. My sister lost everything she'd spent 8 years building." The kitchen went quiet enough that she could hear the fire in the stove. "You came here because of Calhoun," she said slowly. "I came here following a pattern." His voice was even, but it cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. 3 towns in 2 years, same method, different names. Millhaven was next on a list I put together from land records in Cheyenne. I didn't know whose land specifically. I just knew the pattern was here. And then you found me at Pruitt's store. And then I found you at Pruitt's store. She absorbed this. The whole architecture of what she'd believed rearranged itself, not collapsing but shifting, finding a new shape. He hadn't stopped randomly for a widow with a coin. He'd been in Millhaven deliberately following something real and dangerous, and she had walked into the middle of it without knowing. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes." No argument. "I should have. I was trying to understand the scope of it. First, I didn't want to frighten you without something solid to tell you. That was wrong. It was your land, and your right to know." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" He met her eyes directly. No. She believed him. She wasn't sure she should, but she did, and she'd stopped pretending that her instincts about Luke Morgan were unreliable. "How long do I have before Pruitt calls the note?" "The payment date is the 1st of the month. That's 19 days. He set the cup down. "But Calhoun doesn't wait for the deadline. In Montana, they moved on my sister's property 3 days early, caught the family before they could arrange alternative funds. He'll do the same here. So I have less than 19 days. Probably closer to 2 weeks, maybe less." Eliza stood up. She moved to the window. Thomas was still asleep. She could hear him through the thin wall, the quiet, oblivious breathing of a child who didn't yet know that the ground under his home was being eaten away. "What did your sister do?" she asked. "In Montana." A pause. Long enough that she turned to look at him. "She fought," he said. "But she didn't have the right help in time. The local judge was. He wasn't impartial." His voice was flat and controlled in the way that meant it was covering something much less flat. "She lost the land. And you've been following Calhoun since. Trying to get ahead of him. Trying to find a situation where there's still time." He looked at her steadily. "You still have time, Eliza. 19 days is not nothing, but we have to move." She turned fully from the window. "What do we do, Gilshan?" They spent the morning at the table with Daniel's paper spread between them and every other document from the tin box laid out in order. Luke had a systematic mind. He went through everything methodically, reading each page, making notations on a scrap of paper in a hand that was surprisingly precise for a man who worked with rope and tools. There was a problem with the original loan document. Luke found it. "Look at this," he said, turning the paper toward her and pointing to a line in the middle of the text. "The repayment terms, they're written with a conditional clause. In the event of the borrower's death, repayment terms are subject to renegotiation at the lender's discretion." Eliza read it again. "What does that mean for me?" "It means Pruitt can argue the original term is void and reset it to whatever he wants. He can call it due immediately." Luke set the paper down. But it also means the original 60-day term he's been quoting has no legal standing. If this clause is what I think it is, a proper attorney would argue the entire document is ambiguous and unenforceable as written. Is there an attorney in Millhaven? No. Nearest one is in Clearwater, 40 miles west. 40 miles. She did the calculation fast. There and back in 2 days if she pushed. But she couldn't leave Thomas alone. Couldn't take him out of the homestead for 2 days. Couldn't afford the boarding costs in Clearwater. I'll ride to Clearwater, Luke said. Luke, I know the situation. I know the document. I can explain it to an attorney accurately. He said it practically not heroically, just laying out a logical fact. You stay here, you keep the homestead running, you don't give Pruitt any visible sign that you know what he's planning. If he thinks you're still in the dark, he won't accelerate his timeline. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. And if the attorney says the document is enforceable, then we find another way. His voice didn't waver. But we find that out before we start panicking, not after. Thomas appeared in the doorway, then sleep-rumpled and barefoot, looking at both of them at the table, with the alert suspicion of a child who can read a room. Why are you up so early? Paperwork. Eliza said, her voice easy. Go get dressed. I'll make breakfast. Thomas looked at Luke. Are you staying for breakfast? If your mama's offering. Thomas disappeared back toward his room, apparently satisfied. Eliza gathered the papers into the tin box, put it back under the floor, and started the breakfast with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. That was the thing grief had taught her that nothing else could, how to keep your hands steady while everything inside was moving. Luke left for Clearwater the next morning before light. He gave her no promises about what the attorney would say, no reassurances she'd have to decide whether to believe. He said, I'll be back by Friday. Don't go into town if you can help it. He touched the brim of his hat in that way he had, and he rode out. She didn't watch him go from the porch. She had too much to do to stand on the porch watching roads. The 2 days he was gone were the longest she could remember since the 2 days after Daniel died. She worked herself to the edge of exhaustion both days deliberately because the work left no room for the kind of thinking that led nowhere useful. She mended Fielding's shirts. She turned the new section of garden. She fixed the lean-to latch herself with a hammer and 2 nails and some language that she was glad Thomas didn't hear. Thomas asked about Luke once on the first evening. When's he coming back? Friday, she said. Thomas nodded like that was sufficient. He trusted Luke's comings and goings with a completeness that both moved her and frightened her, the way children attach to people who feel safe with no self-protective instinct, no hesitation, no understanding of how badly it can go wrong. She couldn't protect him from that. She'd stopped trying to protect herself from it. That was the most frightening part. Luke came back Thursday evening a day early, and the fact that he'd pushed the ride told her something before he said a word. She was in the yard when he rode in. She looked at his face. Tell me, she said. The attorney's name is Harlan Webb. He's legitimate. I checked with the county clerk before I spoke to him. Luke dismounted, tied the horse. He read the document. The conditional clause is genuine ambiguity. He said any circuit judge would look at this and see a problem with enforcement. That's good. That's the good part. He turned to face her. The problem is that Pruitt knows this too, or Calhoun does. Webb said he's seen this kind of document before in 2 other cases. Calhoun drafts them deliberately ambiguous. The clause gives Pruitt flexibility to call the note early, but it also creates enough confusion that by the time you'd argue it in court, Pruitt has already transferred the property. Eliza's stomach dropped. He moves before it can be challenged. Exactly. Webb says the only real protection is a counterfiling. We document the ambiguity formally with the land office file a dispute on the debt terms and create a legal record that any transfer would have to answer to. He paused. That buys time. It doesn't eliminate the debt. How much time? 30 to 60 days minimum before a transfer could be legally finalized. Enough time to find the $60 or challenge the debt properly. $60. She had 11. The mending work would bring another 6 or 7 when she delivered it. She was still $40 short of a number that felt like a wall. "There's something else," Luke said. His voice shifted something careful in it. "Webb knows Calhoun. He's been trying to build a case against him for 2 years, fraudulent witnessing collusion with local merchants, and in one case, he suspects outright forgery on a debt document. He wants to see your paper." She looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because if your document has the same structural language as the others, and from what I described, he believes it does, it's evidence. It connects Calhoun to a pattern across state lines. He wants to use my land dispute to build a case against Calhoun. He wants to help you and build a case at the same time. Webb says those two things don't have to be in conflict." Luke met her eyes. "But it's your decision. Your document, your land, your call." She breathed. The evening was cold, the light going blue-gray at the edges. Thomas's voice coming from inside where he was talking to himself over some game she couldn't quite make out. "If Webb files the counter-dispute and Calhoun knows about it," she said slowly, "he accelerates. He won't wait. No. He'll move immediately. So we'd be inviting a faster attack in exchange for a legal record that slows the transfer." "That's the trade, yes." She looked at him. "What would you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd file," he said, "because the alternative is waiting for Pruitt to move on his timeline and having no record at all. At least this way you're fighting forward, not just defending." "Fighting forward?" she repeated. "You've been doing it since I met you. This is just doing it with a lawyer's name behind it." She almost smiled. Almost. "When can Webb come?" "He can be here by Monday if I ride back tomorrow with your answer." "Then ride back tomorrow." He nodded. "No celebration, no? I told you so." "Just all right, that's what we do next." She appreciated that more than she could have explained. He did not ride back the next morning, because that night everything changed. It started with Thomas. Eliza woke at some hour past midnight to a sound she didn't immediately identify. Not quite crying, not quite coughing. A thin, ragged sound that pulled her out of sleep with the particular velocity that only a mother knows. The way your body answers your child before your mind fully arrives. She was in Thomas's doorway in seconds. He was burning, not warm, not feverish in the ordinary way. Burning his skin so hot, she pulled her hand back when she touched his forehead, his small chest working too hard, each breath shallow and labored in a way that didn't sound like a chest cold or a winter cough. It sounded like something wrong inside, something deep and serious, and her stomach turned to ice. "Thomas." She was already pulling the blanket back, already assessing with her hands and her eyes. "Baby, look at me." He opened his eyes. They were glassy, unfocused, and he said her name wrong, Mama, with a slur at the edge too slow, and she knew. She'd seen fever like this before. Her brother when she was 12. The way it came on fast, the way it went deep, the way you could lose someone to it inside 48 hours if you didn't move. She did not let herself panic. She moved instead. She had the quilt soaked in cold water and folded against his forehead within 2 minutes. She had water at his lips, urging sips, talking to him quietly and continuously, because she'd heard that voice mattered, that hearing his mother's voice would keep some part of him present and fighting. She built the fire up. She sat beside him on the bed with her hand on his chest, feeling each breath, counting them, measuring against some internal scale of this is bad, and this is worse, that she'd assembled from every bit of frontier knowledge she owned. He was worse. By the time the sky started to go from black to charcoal gray, Thomas's breathing had become a sound she refused to name, but that lived in her worst nightmares. A wet, labored sound low in his chest. Pneumonia. She was almost certain. The nearest doctor was a man named Cass, 12 miles north in a town called Ridley. She had no way to reach Ridley. She had a horse, but she couldn't take the horse and leave Thomas alone and burning with no one to watch him. She had no neighbors close enough to ride for. She had nothing. Except. She went to the window. She did something she had not done in the entire time she'd known Luke Morgan, not once, not even in the worst nights of the past weeks. She needed him. Not wanted. Not appreciated. Needed in the raw, urgent, undisguised way that stripped every wall down to nothing. She pulled on her coat over her nightgown, and she went to the barn, and she saddled June with shaking hands. And she rode not to Millhaven, not toward town, but east, toward where she'd once glimpsed a lamp at night, and calculated he must have set a camp when he stayed late working. She rode hard, calling his name into the dark before she even reached the tree line. Luke! Luke Morgan! She heard him before she saw him movement a lamp raised. Eliza! His voice was sharp, immediate, already alert. What happened? Thomas, she said. He's burning. His chest, it's bad, Luke. I think it's pneumonia, and I can't get to Ridley alone, and I can't leave him. She heard him moving fast, heard the horse, saw his shape in the lamplight already pulling the saddle. Go back to him, he said. Stay with him. I'll get Cass. It's 12 miles. I know how far it is. He was mounted before she finished the sentence. Go back to your boy Eliza. I'll bring the doctor. She looked at him just 1 second, one single second, and what she felt in that moment was too large and too complicated to be called by any one name. It was gratitude and terror, and something that went underneath both of them, something foundational. She turned June and rode back hard. She didn't know how long it took. She lost the ability to track time somewhere around the point where Thomas's breathing got worse, where each exhale became a fight she could hear from across the room, and she pressed her ear close to his chest and prayed with a specificity and urgency she hadn't managed since Daniel died. She talked to Thomas the whole time. She told him about June. She told him about the letters he was learning. She told him because she was running out of practical things, and her heart was breaking open in the dark, that he was the bravest person she knew, that he was the reason she got up every morning, that she needed him to stay with her. I'm here, Mama, he said once, very faint, his eyes half open. I'm not going anywhere. She pressed her face against his shoulder and did not let him hear her cry. The wind picked up outside. She could feel it through the walls, the kind of hard-cutting Wyoming wind that made 12 miles a serious proposition. She thought about Luke out in it, riding into the teeth of it, and she actively hoped something she'd stopped allowing herself, that he made it. She heard hoofbeats, not one horse, two. She was at the door before it opened. Luke came through first, soaked through from wind and effort, his hat gone somewhere on the road. Behind him was a man in his 50s she didn't know, carrying a black bag, already reading the situation from her face. Dr. Cass, he said, and moved past her directly toward the sound of Thomas's breathing. Professional and immediate, no preamble, she was grateful for that. Luke stayed in the doorway. She looked at him. Truly, looked at him the way she hadn't let herself yet, without any of the walls and careful management she'd maintained for weeks. He was breathing hard. His coat was soaked. He had a cut on his jaw that hadn't been there before from a branch or a fall in the dark she didn't know. He'd ridden 12 miles in Wyoming wind at 2 a.m. without hesitation or complaint, and he'd brought the doctor back, and he was standing in her doorway, like a man who has done what needed doing and requires nothing from it. You're hurt, she said. It's nothing. He looked past her toward Thomas's room. How is he? The doctor's with him now. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The wind outside was loud enough to fill the silence, but what was in the room between them was louder. Thank you, she said. And then, because it wasn't enough, and she knew it, Luke. He looked at her. I know what this cost you. The ride in that weather, I know. Her voice was steady, barely. I know. He's a good boy, Luke said quietly. He deserves to be okay. Dr. Cass worked for an hour. Luke sat in the kitchen with cold coffee and waited without being asked to leave, without being asked to do anything. He was simply there, a steady presence in a night that had no other steady things. When Cass came out, he said, pneumonia. You were right to come fast. He said it to Eliza, but he glanced at Luke. Caught it early enough. He needs rest fluids, this. He set a small bottle on the table. 3 days' worth. Fever should break by tomorrow night if we're lucky. He needs to be watched through tonight." "I'll watch him," Eliza said immediately. "I know you will." Cass looked at her with the bluntness of a frontier doctor. "You look like you've been watching him all night already. You need someone to spell you." She opened her mouth to say she was fine. She looked at Luke. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, quiet and direct, and he said nothing, and somehow his saying nothing was the most effective argument she'd ever encountered. "I can take the first watch," Luke said to her. 3 hours. Then you." She meant to argue. She meant to say she was the mother and it was her place and she didn't need "okay," she said. The word came out before the argument did. She showed him where everything was. She stood in the doorway of Thomas's room and watched Luke settle into the chair beside the bed, large and quiet in the small room. His hands loose on his knees, and she watched Thomas's face in the firelight, and she thought about all the different kinds of being saved. The dramatic kind, the riding 12 miles in the dark kind, and then the quieter kind, the sitting in a chair kind, the spelling a mother who has been alone too long kind. She went and lay down on her own bed. She did not expect to sleep. She slept within minutes, the deep, absolute sleep of a body that has finally allowed itself to trust that someone else is standing watch. She woke to gray light and the sound of Thomas's voice. Not the thin, ragged voice of the night. Something closer to his real voice, still weak, still rough, but present, recognizable. Hers. She was up and through the door before she was fully conscious. Thomas was awake. Not sitting up, not well, but awake. Eyes clear, focused on Luke, who was still in the chair beside him, both of them apparently in the middle of some conversation that had been going on for a while. "Mama says it's the biggest bird in Wyoming," Thomas was saying, hoarse and serious, continuing some debate she'd missed the beginning of. She said, "Sandhill Crane might argue with you," Luke said, and his voice was tired. He'd been in that chair all night but completely present. Thomas's eyes found her in the doorway. "Mama." She crossed to him and put her hand on his forehead, still warm, not burning. The difference was everything. She pressed her lips to his hairline and stayed there for a moment, just breathing. When she straightened, she looked at Luke. He looked exhausted, and his jaw had a bruise coming up around the cut, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for, something open and careful, at the same time something that was waiting for her to decide what it was. "You've been up all night," she said. "I'm all right. Luke?" She said his name the way you say a name when you mean something too large for sentences. "Go sleep in the barn. There's a cot in the back stall. I'll call you if anything changes." He started to say he'd ride back to his camp. "The barn," she said. "You're not riding anywhere in that condition." He looked at her for a moment, then at Thomas, who had closed his eyes again and was already drifting back toward sleep, with the trusting ease of a child who feels safe. "All right," he said. He stood, rolled his shoulders, picked up his hat from the floor. It had made it after all. She realized he must have gone back for it, and he walked toward the door. He paused. "Eliza." She looked at him. "The fever's breaking," he said. "He's going to be fine." She nodded. Her throat was doing something she didn't want to explain. He went to the barn. She sat in the chair he'd vacated, still warm from him, and she took her son's hand in both of hers, and she sat there in the quiet morning, with the wind gone down and the light coming pale through the window. And she thought about what it meant that she was not alone. Not what it meant for the land. Not what it meant for Pruitt or Calhoun or the $60 she still didn't have. What it meant for her. 25 years old, and she had been so sure that the price of needing someone was always higher than she could afford to pay. She had been so sure that letting someone in was a transaction that would eventually come due in a way she couldn't survive. Thomas's hand was small in hers. His breathing was easier. Outside, the light was growing ordinary and indifferent, and in the barn, a man who had ridden 12 miles in the dark and then sat up all night was finally sleeping. She didn't move. She just held her son's hand and let herself sit in the truth of it. She had let someone in, and the world had not ended, and her son was breathing. That was enough. For right now, in this moment, that was enough. The $60 would have to wait until morning. Thomas's fever broke on the second night, exactly the way Dr. Cass had said it would, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just a slow easing the heat going out of him, the way a fire goes, when it's finally burned through everything it had to burn. Eliza felt it under her palm at some point, past midnight, the change in his skin, and she sat very still for a full minute, just feeling it before she allowed herself to believe it. She put her forehead down on the blanket beside his hand and breathed. "Thank you," she thought to whoever or whatever was listening. Just thank you. Luke had slept 6 hours in the barn and come back in the evening without being summoned, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the quiet matter-of-factness that she'd stopped questioning. He'd heated soup. He'd spelled her again at midnight. By the time the fever broke, he was in the chair, and she was on the small cot she'd dragged in from the storage room, and when she woke and went to him and said, "It's breaking," his shoulders dropped with a relief he hadn't let her see until that moment. "Good," he said. Just that. But the word carried everything. Thomas spent the next 2 days in bed, irritable, demanding, and deeply put out by the injustice of being forbidden to go outside, which Eliza took as an excellent sign. A sick Thomas was frighteningly quiet. An annoyed Thomas arguing with her about whether he was well enough to see the horse was her actual child restored. Luke bore the brunt of his complaints with a patience that bordered on inhuman. "Mr. Luke, tell Mama I'm fine." "Your Mama's right," Luke said without looking up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table. Thomas stared at him with betrayal. "You're supposed to be on my side. I'm on the side of you not getting sicker. Those are the same side right now." Thomas looked at Eliza. She looked back at him unmoved. He pulled the blanket over his head and made a sound of profound injustice into the fabric. Luke caught Eliza's eye across the table. There was something in his expression, warm and exhausted, and almost amused, and she looked away before either of them could make anything of it. But she felt it. She felt it the way you feel something true. On the third day, while Thomas was sleeping and the house had gone quiet, Eliza sat across from Luke at the kitchen table with the tin box open between them again, and they returned to the problem that illness had interrupted. 10 days left before the payment date. Probably 7 or 8 before Pruitt moved. "Webb," she said, "can you still reach him in time?" "If I leave tomorrow morning." Luke looked at the document. "But there's something I need to tell you first. Something Webb said that I didn't have a chance to explain before Thomas got sick." She waited. "Calhoun is going to be in Millhaven." Luke said it carefully, watching her face. "Webb had information from a contact in Cheyenne. Calhoun's riding in sometime this week to finalize what he expects to be a property acquisition. He thinks the deal is done. He's coming to collect." The room was very still. "He's already here," Eliza said. "Possibly. Or in the next few days." Luke leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "This changes the calculation. If Webb files the counter-dispute and Calhoun knows it, he won't wait for Pruitt to move through normal channels. He'll find another way to pressure you. Maybe legal, maybe not." "What does maybe not mean?" Luke's jaw was set. "In Montana, after my sister filed a counterclaim, someone set fire to the fence line on the eastern pasture. Couldn't be proven it was Calhoun's people, but you think he'd do that here? I think he's done it before and gotten away with it." His voice was flat and controlled in the way that meant something heated underneath. "I want you to understand the full picture before you decide. Filing with Webb is the right legal move, but it may provoke a reaction that's more than legal." Eliza looked at the document on the table. She looked at the tin box, at all of Daniel's papers, at the record of a marriage and a homestead, and a life that had been handed to her incomplete, with debts she hadn't known about, and gaps she'd had to fill with her own 2 hands. "What happened to your sister?" she asked. "After the fire." "She lost the land. But Calhoun didn't get it the way he wanted. Webb had enough by then to bring a fraud complaint in Cheyenne. Calhoun was fined, lost his operating license for a year." Luke's voice was quiet. It wasn't justice, but it was something. It wasn't enough. "No." She pressed her palms flat on the table. I'm not losing this land, Luke. Thomas grew up here. Daniel is buried on this land. Whatever Calhoun thinks he's coming here to collect, he's wrong. Luke looked at her with those steady gray eyes. Then we file with Webb. We file and we're ready for whatever comes after. What does ready mean practically? He was quiet for a moment. It means you're not alone when it comes. That's what it means. She looked at him. You've been following Calhoun for 18 months. This is your chance to have evidence against him. My situation, my document, a pattern across 3 states. Yes. Is that why you're still here? After everything, the fence, the horse, Thomas, is this still about Calhoun for you? The question sat between them. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came from somewhere honest and a little raw, and she let it sit there because she needed the answer, and she needed it true. Luke was quiet long enough that she felt the first edge of fear. It started that way, he said. I won't lie to you about that. I came to Millhaven because of Calhoun, and I saw you because I was already watching the town. He stopped, picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. That's where it started. It is not where it is now. But I understand if you need more than my word on that. What would more than your word look like? I don't know, he said honestly. I think that's something only time proves. I can't compress it into a conversation no matter how much I'd like to. She sat with that. It was the right answer. She knew it was the right answer, and that made it harder somehow than a neat and reassuring lie would have been. Ride to Webb tomorrow, she said. Tell him to come. Luke left before dawn. She heard him in the barn, heard the horse, heard the sound of hoofbeats fading east, and then the homestead was just her and Thomas, and the specific weight of waiting. Thomas came into the kitchen that morning, walking under his own power, slow and still pale, but determined, and announced that he was hungry for something that was not soup. She made him eggs and toast, and watched him eat with an appetite that confirmed he was genuinely recovering. And she thought, whatever happens with the land, whatever Pruitt and Calhoun are planning, I won this. This morning, this boy eating eggs at my table. I won this. She needed that thought in the next few hours, because the next few hours required everything she had. Gerald Pruitt came at 10 o'clock in the morning. He didn't ride alone. He came with a man Eliza had never seen trim well-dressed for the frontier with the kind of careful grooming that said he'd come from somewhere with better resources than Millhaven. He had the document look about him. He had the look of a man who dealt in paper. Calhoun. She knew it before Pruitt introduced him. They tied their horses at her fence and walked up to the porch, and Pruitt said with a courtesy that sat on top of something much less courteous. Morning, Mrs. Harper. This is Mr. Calhoun, a business associate. We were hoping to have a word. Eliza stood in the doorway, and she did not invite them in. Mr. Pruitt, she said. Mr. Calhoun. She looked at Calhoun directly. He was maybe 50, with eyes that assessed everything and rested nowhere, the kind of eyes that were always calculating the next position before they'd finished with the current one. What can I do for you? Payment on your land note is coming due shortly, Pruitt said. We wanted to discuss your options given the circumstances. My options, she said. There's no shame in a situation being beyond a person's means, Calhoun said. His voice was smooth and genial, the kind of voice trained to make the thing it was saying sound like the most reasonable thing in the world. Especially for a widow managing alone. I represent a land acquisition company that could take this property off your hands at fair market value. You'd walk away with your debt cleared and cash in hand. A fresh start. She looked at him. You've been watching this property. I've been aware of the situation, yes. Before my husband died or after? A tiny pause. We became aware of it recently. My husband signed that document 6 months before he died, she said. 6 months, Mr. Calhoun. That document was drafted before Daniel was in the ground. So I'll ask again. Were you aware of this property before my husband died or after? Calhoun's expression didn't change. Practiced. The timing of our awareness is really not relevant to, it's relevant to me. She kept her voice completely level. It is, in fact, extremely relevant to me. Pruitt shifted his weight. He was less comfortable than Calhoun. He was a local man, he had to live in this town, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was finding this harder in practice than it had seemed in planning. Eliza, the note is due in 10 days. 8? Calhoun corrected. And something in that automatic correction, the precision of a man who has been counting days very carefully, told her everything about how deliberately he'd timed this visit. 8 days, she agreed. I'm aware. We're offering you a clean exit, Calhoun said. Fair market. No court proceedings, no public difficulty. You keep your dignity and your son is provided for. She looked at him for a long moment. Thomas was inside. She'd told him to stay in his room, and she could hear him back there mercifully compliant, probably asleep. I'll consider your offer, she said. Calhoun's eyes sharpened. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears or argument. You will? I'll consider it. I'll also be consulting with an attorney regarding the terms of the original document before I make any decision. She watched his face very carefully when she said attorney. There a flicker, tiny and controlled, but present. You understand. It would be irresponsible of me not to. Of course, Calhoun said, and his voice had not changed at all, and that scared her more than if it had. We'll be in touch. They left. She watched their horses go down the lane, and she turned and went inside and leaned against the closed door and let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds. Thomas appeared from the hallway. Mama. Who were those men? Business, she said. Nothing you need to worry about. He looked at her with Daniel's eyes, perceptive patient, seeing more than she wanted him to. You're shaking. I'm cold. It's not that cold. She looked at her 6-year-old son and thought he deserves honesty. Not the full weight of it, not the debt and Calhoun and the thin margin between keeping this land and losing it, but something honest. We're going to have a difficult couple of weeks, she said, but I'm handling it, and Mr. Luke is helping, and we're going to be all right. Thomas considered this with the gravity he brought to serious information. Then he said, okay, and went back to his room. She stood in the kitchen and thought, I need to get word to Luke. She couldn't reach him. He was already riding somewhere between the homestead and Clearwater, and she had no way to intercept. She thought about riding into Millhaven, then decided against it. She didn't want Pruitt to see her in town. She didn't want to give Calhoun any information about her movements, so she waited. She worked. She mended shirts with hands that had to be forced to stay steady, and she turned over in her mind everything Calhoun had said. Every word, every pause, every small calculation in those restless eyes. He'd said 8 days, not 10. The payment date was still 10 days out, which meant Pruitt intended to call the note 2 days early, exactly the way he'd done in Montana, exactly the way Luke had predicted. She had 8 days, maybe less. That evening, Sam Fielding's son rode up the lane with the second batch of mending she'd delivered and an envelope in his hand. Pa asked me to bring this, he said, and turned back before she could ask him anything. Inside the envelope was $30. She stared at it, counted it twice. A note in Fielding's blunt handwriting said, Heard you're having a rough season. Consider the extra an advance on fall mending work. You'll earn it. No flourish, no sentiment. Just here is practical help. Here is a dignified reason for it, you'll earn it back. She sat down at the kitchen table with $30 in her hands and 11 more in the tin box, and she thought about Sam Fielding, who she'd negotiated horse terms with across a table, who'd looked at her then with the respect of a man who recognized someone who knew their own worth. And she thought about how community worked quietly and without announcement in the spaces between all the public gossip and judgment. $41. She needed 60. 19 short. She was still sitting there when she heard the horse. Luke came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. What happened? She told him. All of it Calhoun at the porch. The 8-day timeline Fielding's envelope. She watched him process it, watched the calculation move through his eyes. He's spooked, Luke said. Coming here himself that early, he's not confident. If he were confident, he'd let Pruitt handle it. What spooked him? Webb. Luke sat down. I reached him. He's filing the counter dispute tomorrow morning. He must have already made inquiries, put out word that someone was looking at the Millhaven land records. Calhoun has sources. He moves when he feels watched. So the filing spooked him, and now he's moving faster. Yes. But here's what that means. Luke leaned forward, and his voice had an urgency in it she hadn't heard before. He's moving fast because he's scared of what Webb has. If the document was clean, if the debt was legitimate, he wouldn't care about attorneys. He'd wait out the timeline. He's here because he knows Webb can hurt him. She absorbed this. That's something. It's more than something. Webb filed the counter dispute this morning. I waited to make sure it was recorded before I left. Calhoun can't transfer this property without answering to that filing. Not legally. You said not legally. Yes. She looked at him steadily. What are you not saying? He met her eyes. Calhoun has operated outside the law before. I told you about the fire in Montana. He's not above finding other ways to make a situation uncomfortable enough that a person decides selling is easier than fighting. He paused. I don't think he'll do anything with Thomas here, but I think you should know the possibility exists. She thought about this. She thought about it very carefully, the way she thought about most things now, not with the first emotion that rose up, but with the deliberate precision she'd been building for 4 months. I'm not leaving this land, she said. I know. And I'm not sending Thomas away. I know that too. So what does being ready actually look like? Luke looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. Webb is bringing 2 things when he comes: the formal filing and testimony from a land fraud case in Colorado that links Calhoun directly to a pattern of predatory acquisition. If he can get that testimony into the record here, Calhoun doesn't just lose this deal. He faces charges. When does Webb arrive? Friday? 3 days. 3 days. She turned the number over. 8 days before Pruitt moved, 3 days until Webb arrived, and a gap in the middle where anything could happen. The money, she said. I have $41. I have 30 more. He said it simply the way he said most things. It's not charity. It's a loan, and you can pay it back however and whenever you're able, or not at all if it comes to that. But if $60 is what settles this before it goes to court, then between what you have and what I have, you're covered. She stared at him. $71, she said slowly. That's more than the debt. Which means if Pruitt tries to claim additional fees or interest, which Calhoun will likely advise him to do, you still have the number. You walk in there, you pay the debt in full, plus whatever they invent, and there is nothing left for them to stand on. She looked at this man across her kitchen table. This man who had ridden into her life 6 weeks ago with a coil of rope and no apparent agenda, who had fixed her fence and negotiated her horse, and ridden 12 miles in the dark for her son, and now was offering to lay $30 on the line for a piece of land that wasn't his. Why? She said, and her voice came out lower than she expected. Luke, I need you to tell me why. Not the Calhoun reason, not the pattern across 3 states reason. Why this land? Why Thomas? Why me? He was quiet for a moment, not the avoidant quiet of a man who doesn't want to answer. The gathering quiet of a man who wants to answer right. Because I've been moving for 18 months, he said, and this is the first place that's made me feel like stopping might be possible. He looked at his hands, then at her. Because your son is the best kind of human being I've encountered in longer than I can remember, honest and brave and completely unspoiled. Because you... He stopped, took a breath. Because you're the most quietly remarkable person I've ever met. And you don't know it, and that somehow makes it more true. The kitchen was completely silent. Eliza felt something move through her that she hadn't let herself feel in so long that she'd half believed she'd lost the capacity for it. Not gratitude, not relief. Something warmer and more frightening than either. I'm still figuring out who I am, she said carefully. After Daniel, I don't know all of myself yet. I know that. I'm not in a position to promise anything. I'm not asking for promises. His voice was very steady. I'm asking for the chance to stay. That's all. Just don't send me away. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she'd been reading for 6 weeks, the face that had never once asked her for something she couldn't give. You can stay, she said. For now. That's what I can offer. That's enough, he said, and he meant it. Webb arrived Friday morning earlier than expected, which turned out to be fortunate. Because Pruitt moved on Friday afternoon, he arrived with Calhoun and a man Eliza didn't recognize. Heavy-set quiet, the kind of man who stood slightly behind the other men and watched the exits, and Pruitt had a paper in his hand that he held out toward her like a shield. Notice of accelerated payment, he said. Terms of the original agreement. Let me see it. Luke was standing beside her on the porch. He hadn't positioned himself in front of her. He was simply beside her, which was exactly right. Pruitt blinked at him. He'd gotten used to Eliza alone. The variable of Luke Morgan clearly disrupted his calculation. Eliza took the paper herself. She read it. This claims an additional $15 in accrued interest. Standard terms. Show me where in the original document it specifies accrued interest. She held the paper steady in her hands. Show me the clause. Calhoun stepped forward. Mrs. Harper, I think what would serve everyone best here is a clean resolution. We're prepared to... Mr. Calhoun. Harlan Webb appeared in the doorway behind her. He was a small man, unimpressive-looking, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked at Calhoun the way a man looks at something he's been studying for a very long time. I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. I have some questions about your business practices in Larimer County, Colorado, and Cascade County, Montana. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Eliza had ever experienced. Calhoun's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then a very careful, very composed neutrality that was more frightening than either of the first 2. I don't believe we've met, Calhoun said. Harlan Webb, attorney at law, Clearwater. Webb stepped fully onto the porch. I've filed a dispute with the county land office regarding the terms of the Harper debt, and I have testimony from a Jacob Marsh of Colorado regarding your involvement in a fraudulent land acquisition scheme that bears considerable structural resemblance to the arrangement you appear to have made with Mr. Pruitt here. He paused. Would you like to continue this conversation on this porch, or would you prefer to have it in front of Judge Carver in Clearwater next Wednesday? Pruitt made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. He looked at Calhoun. Calhoun looked at Webb, at Eliza, at Luke. The calculation in his eyes was running very fast. Any debt resolution can be handled through proper legal channels, Calhoun said finally, and his voice was still smooth, still composed, and Eliza heard the retreat inside it. Yes? Webb agreed pleasantly. It can, and it will be. I've made sure of that. Calhoun looked at Pruitt. Something passed between them, wordless, decisive. Then Calhoun turned and walked back toward the horses. Pruitt stood on the step a moment longer. He looked at Eliza, and in his face, under the self-importance and the calculation, she saw something that might have been shame. Just a flicker of it. Just enough that she knew he'd understood somewhere what he'd been part of. The debt's legitimate, he said. Not to Calhoun's retreating back. To her. Whatever he talked me into, the land debt is real. You still owe $60, Eliza. I know I do, she said. I intend to pay it. She went inside. She came back with the tin box. She counted out $60 on the porch railing in front of him, her 11 Fielding's 30. Luke's 30, counted it twice and pushed it across. That's $60, she said. I'd like a receipt. He wrote it out, his handwriting cramped and unhappy, and he gave it to her and took the money and went to his horse without another word. Eliza held the receipt. Her hands were completely steady. Webb was writing something in his notebook. Luke was standing beside her saying nothing, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cool afternoon air. He'll file the testimony next week, Webb said without looking up from his notebook. Calhoun won't face criminal charges, not yet. Probably not ever. But his license in Wyoming territory will be revoked, and what happened here will be part of the record in the Colorado case. Not justice, Eliza said. She was thinking of Luke's sister, of 8 years of work that hadn't been enough. No, Webb agreed. But it's a wall. Calhoun won't come back to Wyoming. She looked out at the lane, where the dust from Pruitt's horse was still settling. Thomas had come to the doorway. She hadn't heard him get up, and he was watching with the solemn attention of a child who has understood that something important just happened without being able to name it. "Mama," he said, "did we win?" She looked at the receipt in her hands, at the homestead around her repaired and solid, fighting ready, at Luke beside her, quiet and steady, asking for nothing. "We're still here," she said. "That's winning." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "I think that counts," he decided, and went back inside. Luke made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close, the closest she'd heard from him. She looked at him, and the warmth in his face was open and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before, and she thought, 25 years old, and I am standing on land. I just paid for with money I earned and borrowed and received from people who chose to help, and there is a man standing beside me who came back, who keeps coming back. She didn't say any of it. She didn't need to yet. "There's coffee inside," she said. "Is that an invitation?" "It is." He followed her in. Thomas was at the kitchen table with his slate drawing something that appeared to be a horse, but might have been a bird. Webb settled at the table with his papers. The fire was going. For the first time in 4 months, the homestead felt like what it had been built to be. Not finished. Not without problems. Not without the $19 she'd need to pay back, or the winter coming, or the 100 ordinary difficulties of a life run close to the margin. But alive. Fighting. Full of people who had chosen to be there. That was what she had. That was what she'd built. She put the coffee on, and outside the light was going gold toward evening, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, she was not afraid of what tomorrow held. Webb rode out Saturday morning with his papers and his testimony, and a handshake that carried more weight than most embraces. He told Eliza he'd be in touch when the Colorado case moved forward, that her document would be part of the record, that she should keep the receipt from Pruitt somewhere safe and permanent. "You did well," he said before he mounted. "Most people in your position would have taken Calhoun's offer." "Most people didn't have what I had," she said. Webb looked past her at Luke, who was in the yard with Thomas showing him something about the saddle rigging. Then he looked back at Eliza with the particular expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to recognize what he's looking at. "No," he said. "I suppose they didn't." He rode out. Eliza watched him go and then turned back to the yard, to her son and the man teaching him, and she stood there a moment, just letting it exist, the ordinary, impossible fact of it. Then she went inside and started making a list of everything that still needed doing, because that was who she was, and the land didn't care about sentiment. The days that followed were the quietest she'd known since before Daniel died. Not empty quiet. The quiet of things settling, of a house that has come through something and is still standing. Thomas recovered fully by the following Monday and immediately resumed his campaign to be allowed to ride June alone, which Eliza declined on grounds of size and judgment, both of which she felt were legitimate concerns about a 6-year-old on a full-grown horse. Luke took his side on the horse question, which she felt was a betrayal. "He could learn with me right there," Luke said over breakfast, with the careful voice of a man who knows he's on uncertain ground. "He could also fall and break something," she said. "So could you. So could I. You're not 6. He's not fragile." She looked at Luke across the table. He looked back at her, not backing down. He'd learned apparently that she respected her ground being held. Thomas watched this exchange with intense strategic interest, clearly calculating which way it was going. "You sit behind him," she said finally. "Both hands on the reins, both of you, and you go at a walk." Thomas's expression could have powered a small town. "A walk," Luke agreed without any indication of victory. She poured more coffee, and did not let either of them see that she was almost smiling. It was Agnes Whitmore who came next, not with suspicion this time, but with a covered dish and the chastened expression of a woman who has revised her position and found the revision uncomfortable. Eliza saw her coming up the lane and felt her shoulders tighten automatically, but she waited on the porch and let her come. Agnes held out the dish. "Beef stew," she said. "I heard the boy was ill." "He's recovered." Eliza took the dish. "Thank you." A pause. Agnes looked at her hands, then back at Eliza. "I heard what happened with Pruitt, and that man from Cheyenne. News travels. In Millhaven it travels before the horse gets back." Agnes said it without humor, just fact. Then stiffly, with the effort of someone dismantling something they'd built, "I may have spoken out of turn, earlier, about your choices." Eliza looked at her. Agnes Whitmore had probably not said "I may have been wrong" in any form in 20 years, and the effort was visible in every line of her. "You were worried," Eliza said. "Not absolution, just acknowledgement." "I was minding business that wasn't mine." Agnes lifted her chin, which was her version of full admission. "The man helped you keep your land. That counts for something I didn't give it credit for." "It counts for a great deal," Eliza said. Another pause. Agnes looked toward the barn where Luke was visible through the open door working on something. "Is he staying on?" Eliza considered the question and how much of her actual answer to put into words. "He's here," she said. "That's what I know." Agnes seemed to find this sufficient. She nodded once with the finality of a woman closing a chapter. "The stew's better warm," she said, and went back down the lane. Eliza stood on the porch with the dish in her hands and thought about how people revised themselves quietly, awkwardly, without ceremony, and how that revision was its own kind of courage, unglamorous and real. The first frost came in the third week of October, earlier than expected, and it arrived overnight while Eliza was asleep, and Luke was in the barn. He'd taken to sleeping there more nights than not. A fact that neither of them had formally arranged or discussed, that had simply evolved the way most true things between them evolved. She found him in the garden at dawn, covering the remaining crops with burlap against the freeze, working fast and methodical in the cold gray light. She stood in the doorway and watched for a moment the efficient economy of his movements, the way he moved through her land now, like he knew it, like he'd mapped it in his mind and understood where it was tender. She went out and worked beside him without a word. They finished the garden before the sun fully cleared the mountains, and they stood there in the cold, with their breath showing, looking at the covered rows. "We'll lose the late squash," he said. "I know. The rest should hold." He nodded. Then, looking at the garden rather than at her, "I need to ask you something." Her chest did something complicated. "All right. I've been bunking in your barn for 3 weeks. I know. I haven't. I want to be clear that I understand what that is and what it isn't. I'm not assuming anything." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the garden jaw set, and she recognized what this was: Luke Morgan doing the thing he did, which was being careful with her, making sure she had all the room she needed, not pushing into space she hadn't opened. "What are you asking?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. He finally looked at her. "I'm asking whether you want me here. Not in the barn because there's work to do and the weather's turning. Here, on this land, with you and Thomas. As something that has a name and a shape, and doesn't have to be figured out one day at a time." He stopped. "I'm asking if you want to stop negotiating the terms of this by the week and just decide." The frost was everywhere. The burlap covered the garden. The sun was coming up cold and clear. "You said you'd been moving for 18 months, she said. "Yes." "And you said this was the first place that made you think stopping was possible." "I meant it." "What does stopping look like specifically?" She wasn't being difficult. She genuinely needed to know because she was 25 years old, and she'd already had one marriage where the practical realities had been left vague, and the vagueness had cost her. "What are you actually asking for?" He looked at her steadily. I'm asking to work this land alongside you. To be someone Thomas can count on, to still be here next month and the month after. To earn the right over time, to be more to you than the man who fixed the fence. He paused. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm asking for the chance to be someone who stays. The word landed exactly the way it always did when he said things that were true. Someone who stays. She thought about the coin on Pruitt's counter, the loan document under the floor, the 12 miles of Wyoming wind that hadn't stopped him, the chair beside Thomas's bed still warm from him when she'd woken. She thought about Daniel, who she had loved genuinely and fully, and who had also left her unprepared in ways that weren't malice, but were still real. She thought about what she wanted the next 25 years to look like, and the 25 after that, and whether she was brave enough to want it out loud. You'll have to meet the North Fence standard, she said. He blinked. I'm sorry. If you're going to work this land alongside me, I have expectations. She kept her face serious. The North Fence you put in is the standard. Everything else has to match it. He stared at her for a moment. Then something broke open in his face, genuine, unguarded, the first full smile she'd seen from him that didn't hold anything back. I can do that, he said. And Thomas gets a vote. Of course he does. He'll probably vote yes immediately, and without conditions, which is going to make me look unreasonable by comparison. You've never been unreasonable a day since I met you. I've been suspicious and guarded and difficult. Those are different things entirely. She looked at him. The sun was up now, real and cold and clear, and the frost was glittering on everything, and her land was covered, and her son was asleep inside, and she was standing in her own garden, with a man who had chosen her, not because she needed saving, not because she was convenient, but because she was worth choosing. Stay, she said, simply directly the way she said things that were true. That's my answer. Stay. He didn't move towards her. He waited the way he always waited, letting her close whatever distance she decided to close. She stepped forward one step and put her hand against his chest over his coat, feeling his heartbeat through the layers steady and real. He covered her hand with his. That was all. Just his hand over hers, and both of them standing in the frost with the whole of the day ahead of them. Bogged. Thomas took the news with the equanimity of a child who has considered this outcome for some time and found it satisfactory. I knew, he announced at breakfast. You knew what? Eliza asked. That he was going to stay. He ate his oatmeal with the unbothered confidence of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. I told you he was good. You did, she agreed. Thomas looked at Luke with the evaluating gaze of a person formalizing an arrangement. You're going to have to teach me to ride properly, he said. Not just walking, real riding. When you're taller, Luke said. How much taller? Enough that your feet can find the stirrups. Thomas looked at his legs with calculation. I'll grow faster, he decided, and finished his oatmeal. Eliza put her hand over her mouth. She was definitely not laughing. They told no one formally, because there was nothing formal to tell, yet no ceremony, no contract, no announcement. But the town of Millhaven was constitutionally incapable of missing a development, and within a week, it was simply understood that Luke Morgan was at the Harper homestead and intended to remain there, and the response was more muted than Eliza had expected. Some of it was the land business, the story of Calhoun and Pruitt, and the $60 had moved through Millhaven with the speed and thoroughness of all frontier news, and the version that emerged wasn't entirely accurate, but was accurate enough. People understood that Eliza Harper had been targeted, had fought back, and had held her land. That kind of story commanded a respect that quieted a fair amount of the other noise. Gerald Pruitt avoided her gaze when she came into the store. She paid cash because she always paid cash now, and he gave her correct change and correct goods and nothing else. She asked for no more and gave no less, and they operated in that functional chill that is not forgiveness, but is the practical arrangement of people who have to share a town. She did not hate him. She'd thought she might. She found instead that she had very little feeling left for him at all. The business of the debt had burned off whatever emotional stake she'd had in his opinion of her, and what remained was simply the awareness that he was a man who had let greed make a coward of him, and that was going to be with him longer than any of it was going to be with her. That seemed sufficient. The deep twist came in November, 6 weeks after Webb had ridden out with his papers, and it came from a direction Eliza hadn't anticipated. A letter arrived forwarded through Webb's office in Clearwater from Helena, Montana. From a woman named Clara Everett, Luke's sister. Eliza read her own name in the opening line and felt the particular strangeness of being known to someone who doesn't know you, of existing in another person's story before you've met. Dear Mrs. Harper, Clara wrote, Mr. Webb has told me something of your situation and what my brother did to help you. I wanted to write because I need you to understand something about Luke that he will never tell you himself. Eliza sat down at the kitchen table. After we lost the ranch, Luke blamed himself. He had been away cattle work in Colorado, and when he came back, the papers were already signed and there was nothing to be done. He has carried that for 18 months. He came to find Calhoun not just for justice, but because he needed to believe he could stop it from happening to someone else, that he could be in time for someone, even if he hadn't been in time for us. I am writing to tell you that my brother is a good man, in the deep and durable way that good men are not the performing kind, but the kind that holds. I have never seen him stay anywhere voluntarily for more than 3 weeks. The fact that he is still on your land tells me something I didn't know if I'd ever see. Please be patient with him. He is still learning that it's all right to stop running. Yours sincerely, Clara Everett. Eliza folded the letter. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. She heard Luke come in from the barn, heard him stop in the doorway when he saw her face. What is it? She held out the letter. He crossed the room, took it, read it. She watched his face the way it moved through recognition, through something unguarded and exposed that he couldn't fully manage, before she saw it through the stillness that came after. He set the letter on the table. She shouldn't have, he started. Don't, Eliza said quietly. Don't say she shouldn't have. It's the truest thing anyone's told me about you. He was very still. You blame yourself for the ranch, she said. It wasn't a question. I wasn't there. You couldn't have known. I should have. Luke. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, the way that meant stop and hear me. You rode 12 miles in the dark in a Wyoming storm for a boy who wasn't yours. You spent your own money on a debt that wasn't yours. You followed a man across 3 states to stop him from doing to someone else what he did to your family. She paused. You were in time. You were exactly in time. Do you understand that? He looked at her. His jaw was set in that way it got when he was holding something in that needed holding. You came here carrying something you shouldn't have to carry alone, she said. I know something about that. I've been carrying things alone for 4 months, and I know how much lighter it gets when someone decides to stand beside you. She held his gaze. I'm standing beside you. That's what this is. Both directions. Something in him shifted. She could see it not breaking, not collapsing, just releasing the way a fist unclenches when it finally trusts that what it's been holding is safe. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Same gesture as the garden. Same steadiness. Both directions, he said. Both directions. They wrote back to Clara together. Eliza's idea, she thought Clara deserved to know that her brother had landed somewhere solid. Luke wrote the first paragraph, stopped, pushed it toward Eliza. She read it, picked up the pen, wrote the second paragraph. They went back and forth across the kitchen table, while Thomas drew horses on his slate and pretended not to be listening, which fooled neither of them. The letter took an hour. It said among other things that Luke was well, that he had found work and purpose and something worth staying for, that Clara was invited to visit in the spring, if the roads permitted. Eliza sealed it herself. Winter came the way Wyoming winter comes, not gradually, not politely, but with the full force of a landscape that does not negotiate. The first real snow arrived in late November and covered everything to the fence tops, and the days shortened down to a thin strip of gray light between dark and dark. The homestead held. Luke and Thomas had banked the walls with straw bales against the cold. Thomas helping with the absolute focused determination he brought to any task Luke assigned him, which was considerable. The livestock were in the barn. The garden was put to bed under its frost covering. The woodpile was the tallest Eliza had ever maintained, stacked against the wall with a precision that was entirely Luke's influence on her son's chaotic approach to stacking. They fell into a life. Not the performing of a life, the actual thing with its routines and its friction and its ordinary difficulty. There were days when the cold made the work brutal and the isolation made the walls close in. There were mornings when Eliza was sharp-tempered before the coffee was ready, and Luke had learned to simply hand her the cup and say nothing until she'd had it. There were evenings when Thomas was impossible stubborn, overtired, convinced that bedtime was a personal injustice, and Luke would sit with him through the argument without taking sides, just present, just steady, just there. Steady. There was one afternoon in December when she and Luke disagreed about the south pasture fence. She wanted to wait until spring. He thought the weak section needed addressing before the snow got heavier. They argued about it with genuine heat, neither of them yielding until Thomas wandered through the kitchen, looked at both of them, said, "Fix the fence, it's leaning," and continued on to his room. They looked at each other. "He's not wrong," Luke said. "Don't," she said, but she was already almost laughing. They fixed the fence, in the snow, together, which made it faster and colder and significantly louder, because Eliza had opinions about technique that she was not shy about expressing, and Luke had a way of listening to her opinions and then doing it his own way that she found both aggravating and deeply characteristic of who he was. The fence held. She told him it was her approach that made the difference. He said nothing in the particular, nothing that meant you might be right, and I'm not giving you the satisfaction of confirming it. She loved him for that. She realized it then, standing in the snow with a fence mallet in her hand and her nose running from the cold, not as a revelation, not as a dramatic understanding, but as a simple, quiet fact that had apparently been true for a while and was only now getting around to being acknowledged. She didn't say it that day. She held it first the way you hold something precious before you put it down somewhere permanent. She said it in January, not dramatically, not with preparation or ceremony. They were sitting by the fire after Thomas was in bed, the way they sat most evenings, now she, with her mending, he, with whatever he was carving or repairing, both of them in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have stopped needing to fill silence. She looked at him across the fire. He was working on a small carved horse, another one for Thomas more detailed than the first. "I love you," she said. Clean and direct, the way she said things that were true. He looked up, his hands stilled. "I've been meaning to say it for a while," she continued. "I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I realized I was waiting because I was still a little afraid, and I'm not afraid of it anymore." She looked at him steadily. "So, I love you. That's what I wanted to say." Luke set the carving down. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been reading her honestly from the first day, that had never once looked at her with anything she had to protect herself from. "I have loved you," he said, "since the morning I found you on that porch with your spine straight and your coin in your hand and no intention of letting anyone see you shake." He said it plainly, the way he said all the things that mattered. "I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't entirely. But I know I'm not going anywhere." "Good," she said, "because I'd argue about it." "I know you would." She went back to her mending. He went back to the horse. The fire was warm, and outside the snow was deep, and in the next room Thomas was asleep under 3 quilts with the carved horse from before sitting on the shelf where he could see it from his bed. He asked her in February. Not with ceremony, not with anything elaborate. He came in from the barn one morning with snow on his coat and set a small ring on the kitchen table. Plain silver, simple, the kind of ring a man buys when he has considered carefully what a woman actually is and what she actually wants. "I've been carrying that since Clearwater," he said. "I've been waiting until I was sure you were ready." She looked at the ring, looked at him. "Are you sure I'm ready?" she said. "I'm sure I want to ask." Only you know if you're ready to answer." She picked up the ring. It was exactly right, plain serious, nothing performative about it. "I have conditions," she said. I assumed. "This land stays in my name." "Of course." "Thomas keeps his father's name until he's old enough to choose for himself." "Agreed." "And you stop letting him negotiate his bedtime through you." Luke paused. "That's going to be the difficult one." "Luke?" "All right, agreed." She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. She looked at it on her hand. The same hand that had slammed the coin on Pruitt's counter, that had pulled the tin box from under the floor, that had felt her son's fever break under her palm in the dark. "Yes," she said, "that's my answer." He came around the table, and she stood up, and he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held fully without reservation, without the managed distance she'd been maintaining for so long, that dropping it felt like setting down something very heavy she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Thomas chose that exact moment to appear in the doorway. He looked at both of them. He looked at the ring on his mother's hand. He looked at Luke. "Does this mean you're my father now?" he asked with the directness of a child for whom the emotional complexity of a situation is less interesting than its practical implications. Luke looked at Eliza. She looked at Luke. "It means," Luke said carefully, "that I'm going to be here every day for the rest of your life. What you call me is your choice. It can be Luke, or it can be something else. We can figure that out." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." Thomas thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "Pa," he announced with the finality of a decision he'd probably made weeks ago and was only now getting around to delivering. "I'll call you Pa." He looked at Eliza. "Can I have breakfast now?" She laughed. Real, full, unguarded, the kind of laugh she'd forgotten she was capable of, that started somewhere deep and came all the way out. "Yes," she said. "Sit down. I'll make biscuits." Thomas sat. Luke sat across from him. Eliza moved to the stove, and the kitchen was warm and full of the ordinary sounds of morning. The fire, the creak of the chair, her son and the man who was going to be his father talking about. Whether sandhill cranes were actually bigger than eagles, a question that had apparently remained unresolved since November. She made the biscuits. She made enough for 3. Spring came slow, and then all at once, the way Wyoming spring comes. Weeks of cold holding, and then a morning that smells different, that has something in it that was gone for months, and the land wakes up like it never forgot how. They planted together. All 3 of them, Eliza directing Luke, executing Thomas, assisting with the chaotic enthusiasm of a child who has learned that being near the work is almost as good as doing it. The north fence held through the winter. The south section they'd argued over in December held too, which Luke did not comment on which was the right call. Sam Fielding came by in April with a proposition. He was expanding his cattle operation and wanted to know if the Harper land could run 20 additional head on summer pasture for fair payment. Eliza negotiated the terms herself with Luke beside her, and Thomas sitting on the fence watching proceedings with the focused attention of a child who is learning how business is done. The terms were good. She shook Fielding's hand. Clara Everett arrived in May. She was smaller than Eliza had imagined from the letter, compact and weathered and sharp-eyed, with a way of taking in a room that reminded her precisely of Luke. She stood in the doorway of the homestead on the afternoon she arrived, looked at Eliza and said, "You're exactly what I hoped." Eliza said, "Come in, the coffee's on." Clara stayed 2 weeks. She and Eliza understood each other with the efficiency of women who have both held land with their bare hands and know what that costs. She told Eliza things about Luke's childhood, not to explain him, but to fill in the spaces he hadn't filled himself, to give her the full picture of who she was building a life with. She played with Thomas with a genuine delight that told Eliza she'd been wanting to be an aunt for a long time. She and Luke argued about everything the way siblings argue, with the complete familiarity of people who have already survived the worst of each other and watching them. Eliza understood something about what family was, the durable and unglamorous kind. When Clara left, she hugged Eliza at the fence and said quietly, "He came back to himself here. Thank you for that." "He did it himself," Eliza said. "That's what I mean," Clara said. The ceremony was small. June, which suited the season and their preference for doing things without excess. Reverend Hartley, who had revised his concerns without being asked to, which Eliza gave him credit for. Sam Fielding and his wife. Agnes Whitmore, who arrived with a second covered dish and the subdued satisfaction of a woman who has come around to something slowly enough to feel she'd always been on its side. Thomas stood between them. He had decided this was his position, and he had not been argued out of it. When Hartley asked Luke if he intended to honor and keep Eliza Harper, Luke said yes, the way he said all the things that mattered directly, without decoration, like a man who has considered it seriously and means every word. When Hartley asked Eliza the same, she said yes, the way she'd learned to say the things that were true. Looking right at Luke, spine straight, clear-eyed, without a trace of a shake. Thomas said, "Finally," under his breath, and Eliza felt it more than heard it, and she pressed her lips together hard to stay composed. She didn't entirely succeed. That evening after the guests had gone and Thomas was in bed, not arguing about it tonight, wearing himself out through the excitement of the day, Eliza stood on the porch of the homestead in the June dark and looked at her land. The north fence solid against the night. The garden full and growing, the barn sound and patched and stacked with hay for the summer. June the horse in her stall. 20 of Fielding's cattle in the south pasture. A house full of the ordinary warmth of a life being lived inside it. Luke came out and stood beside her. They didn't speak for a while. The stars were enormous out here. That was one of the things she'd always loved about this land, how big the sky was, how clear. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about the coin on Pruitt's counter, about the tin box under the floor, about a morning 5 months ago when she'd stood outside and thought, "I don't know if I can do this alone." She wasn't alone. She had not been alone for a long time, and she had stopped being afraid of that and started being grateful for it, and the distance between those two things was the whole story of the last 7 months. "I'm thinking about what this took," she said. "All of it. Every piece of it." He nodded. "And I'm thinking it was worth it." She looked at him. "Every hard thing, every wall I had to come down, every day I almost told you not to come back." She paused. "I'm glad I didn't." "So am I," he said. She took his hand. They stood there together in the June dark on the land she had fought for and paid for and kept. And inside their son was sleeping, and the fence was solid, and the garden was growing, and there was coffee ready for the morning. She had been 25 years old, and alone with a coin that nobody wanted, and she had walked out of that store with her spine straight and her fear hidden, and the world had sent her something unexpected. Not rescue, not salvation, but a man willing to stand beside her while she saved herself. That was the difference. That was always the difference. The Harper homestead stood on good ground, tended by steady hands, and every fence on it was built to last.